So welcome back for part 2 of our discussion on composition. So Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, beautifully composed, maybe not my favorite subject matter in the world, but really well put together painting. So let's take a look at some other old masters' compositions. And let's go to Raphael, Madonna of the Meadow. Again, you can see immediately the structure of this composition, right? Clearly, that good old-fashioned pyramid shape. And again, the pyramid has this real solid structure to it. It has, that solid base and that angular top and this kind of hierarchy. And if we look at the piece, you might be tempted to say, well, clearly, we see the entire focal point, right? And we might be tempted to say, well, at the top of that pyramid, the apex, that's, the real focus. It may be the Madonna, the woman. But I would argue that it's actually not her. Although, again, she sets the scene for this whole drama, right? She has the most colorful outfit, right? Like that rich red and that deep, beautiful blue. But remember, the ultimate contrast is value contrast. And in that sense, the two children, those super white, bright children against that dark blue cloak, really stand out. And I would argue that they are actually the focus. Think about it. Look at where she's looking. Her line of sight takes us down to the first child. And that child is looking at the second and back, right? Plus, have you noticed there's another triangle here, right? Pretty cool. Again, this is not some arbitrary structure. Raphael's really thinking about how to compose this thing and organize it and structure it so that it's pleasing to the eye and keeps our eye moving and happy. And it has this underlying structure that gives, kind of supports the whole scene. There's, like I mentioned, she's looking here, he's looking there. Really, you have to think about where your figures are looking in the composition, because where they look, that space, that element is activated, right? The psychology of where a figure is looking is important. It's also why, you don't want a figure close to the edge looking off that edge of the picture plane, right? If I'm over here at this edge and I'm looking out, it means that I'm activating the area outside of the picture plane. You want your figure hopefully to be more along these lines, like looking here to the larger area of your composition to activate it. Make sense? Again, like where figures are looking, that line of sight, the psychology behind it is really important. So think about it. Okay. You might also think about, here, the the rule of thirds at work here, right? The horizon line, I keep doing that, is at a third. And likewise, this area is at 1/3 every time. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, sorry. Again, another reason to see the two children as the the focal point. They're placed at a third. And that horizon line being at a third is really important for the structure of this piece as well. Okay, so here is Bruegel the Elder, one of my favorite painters. This is a parable of the blind. Let's examine its composition. This one's really fascinating. We probably need to stop and decide, okay, what's the focal point? You could talk about like the entire line of figures as being the focus. But I think within that, we see the group here that's closest to us first. And it's also a pyramid, right? If we look, they form a pyramid structure. But it doesn't end there, right? What about this guy? He's a triangle also. And this guy, right? They're all triangles. And like, look at the roofs in the distance. Like this poor guy at the end, his backside is so, like, I don't know what's going on back here, but I don't think I want to know. Anyway, Bruegel is so intent on making them all triangular that he's willing to deform that poor guy, so he spends eternity looking like that. But so repeating triangles to create this kind of rhythmic structure, right? And speaking of rhythm, like look at their heads and how they're spaced, right? Pretty equal. And then what happens? Got this big space, right? What's going on with that space? Why is that space there? Well, I would argue like that space is the most important decision that he made in this entire composition. Not the repeating triangles, although it's really cool that he repeats them and creates that harmony and that structure and that rhythm. But in establishing that rhythm, right, and then breaking it with that space, he's getting you to sit up and pay attention, right? What happens when you interrupt a pattern? It makes you stop and think and look and examine, okay? So that space isolates those figures in the lower right. This is emphasis through isolation, right? This patch of dirt here, right? That gives us that space, that gives us that separation, and we pay attention when something is separated like that, right? We give it kind of extra weight. It also is a testament to the power of negative space. That patch of brown dirt there is that negative space. And you, again, have to use negative space in conjunction with your positive space to structure things and give your eye a place to rest or to isolate things. That negative space is such an important consideration in every compositional structure. And if you're one of those people who's afraid of negative space, get over it. In Latin, we'd call it horror vacui, like fear of the void. That negative space is your friend, and the more you learn to orchestrate it and weave it into your work, the better your pieces will become, the more interesting they will be. Okay, so let's stop and think again for a minute. Bruegel could have put this whole line of figures on a horizontal line, right? Why didn't he? Like when we think of people walking, we typically think of them walking horizontally, don't we? Bruegel didn't do that. Bruegel was smart. He put them on a diagonal. Why? That diagonal, all these diagonal lines suggest motion. The more diagonals you work into the piece, the more active it will become, the more animated it will seem. If you just put them on a horizontal, boring. Boring, boring, boring. So I want you to think about directional stress when you're composing things, right? If you think about a tree, right? If I have an upright tree, here it is, alive and well. I think, okay, well, that tree is alive, it's upright, it's strong, right? Awake, alert. All right, so what about this tree? A horizontal tree, right? That's a dead tree, right? That's an X tree. It used to be like this, and now it's like this, right? It's at rest. It's asleep. It's dead, right? Horizontals suggest relaxation, okay? And then there's this tree. The tree in between here and here is, that diagonal. It's a tree that's in the process of becoming something else. It's moving. It is in transition from one state to another. Diagonal lines suggest that sort of transition, that sort of movement. That's why Bruegel uses it. All of a sudden, all these figures seem animated, right? In motion. Again, directional stress is really important. And if you go back and think about the pyramid, that pyramid shape is made up of, a horizontal line at the bottom, 2 diagonal lines on either side, and then a vertical line right through the middle, right? The suggestion of that vertical line from the base to the apex. It has within it all of those directional stresses, and that's why we see them as so interesting. And that's why using a pyramid structure is pretty smart in many cases. All right. So, now, let's take a look at Peter de Hooch, right? And I'd like you to pause this video and just think about the way that he structured this painting, Boy Bringing Bread. Pause the video and think about, okay, what's the focal point? What's the structure of this thing? The placement of the focal point, where is it? Anyway, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, usually the first thing that you want to look for, what's the focal point? It's the figures in the foreground here, right? What shape are they? Right? I think you'll probably recognize that, basic shape again. And, again, how does de Hooch really make them stand out? The darkest value in the entire design is the woman's jacket. The most brightly colored, most saturated element in the entire composition is her skirt. The brightest element in the whole composition is the boy's collar and his hat, right? The bright white. Next to those dark darks, next to those saturated colors, our eye goes to those places. And again, you need to do the same thing. Reserve the greatest value contrast, the greatest color contrast, the greatest contrast in shape, or texture, or whatever it is. Reserve the greatest contrast for your focal point. And then the background, support it, right? Okay, so let's think about the structure of this thing. Let's look at value again. Look at the interior, dark interior. Look just outside the door, light exterior. Then look at the hallway in the distance, dark. And then on the other side, light. That pattern of value running through the composition is so important. Value pattern is so critical. The arrangement of the lights and the darks in the composition should be your first consideration. You should place some things and then instantly start thinking about where the dark's going to be? Where are the shadows? Where are the highlights at? Value is your most important ally. It is the most important element. Everything else is second place to value. And Hooch has really thought about value and how to structure this thing according to lights and darks. Right? Brilliant. Let's see here. Right? We've already talked about the focal point, the figures. Greatest value contrast, again, in our focal point. Most saturated color at the focal point. Compositional shapes, we got a pyramid, right? What else do we have, though? Look at the whole, look at all those rectangles. Look at all those squares. The architecture itself has a geometric structure. It's a grid, right? The whole thing is laid out on a grid. The interior is gridded out. The floor that they're standing on is gridded out, and in fact, leads our eye off into the distance using perspectival lines to create that sense of depth. Again, this is really important for graphic designers. Like designing on the grid, like what you do is you lay the whole thing out so that it has this kind of structure, but then you bust out of that structure, right? Everything else is rectangular, but the shapes that make up our focal point, they're not geometric. They're organic. They're biomorphic. Like those figures and their clothes and those shapes contrast with all that geometry. Again, shape contrast, not just value and color, shapes contrast as well. Really smart. So, again, value pattern, shape pattern, right? All right, so let's pull it back. If we think about the components again, subject, content, media, and form, we're trying to create a relationship among all of these things, not just the formal aspects, right? The elements and principles, the form, or how the thing is put together. We need to turn our attention back to the what and the why, right? Subject matter means, what is it? What's the, what is the subject of the piece? In this case, it's a boy bringing a basket of bread to a woman. But the content of the piece, the reason why Hooch painted it, have you thought about that? Because again, all these formal discussions that we've been having about, compositional shapes and using the elements and principles like value and color and shape and movement, balance, all these things are meant to support meaning, right? The subject and its meaning. So, what do you think this painting is about? On one level, it could just be about a boy bringing bread. It's just a slice of life. It's like, hey, this is what happened way back then. Okay? In the 1660s. But I think there's more to it than that. Right? If you look more closely, it's more than just something that's surface level. Like, look at the windows in the upper right corner. What do they remind you of? They look like stained glass, right? And that's not insignificant. It's symbolic. What is the boy bringing? He's bringing bread, which is a universal symbol of life. And what's that relationship? A boy to a woman, right? That's, we've seen that before. You look at the Madonna, the Meadow that we just looked at. Woman with the boys, right? That relationship is important in, in Western religious symbology. You know, look again at that window. Do you see a certain shape there? Right? Again, it's, you know, and, you know, I didn't choose this thing because of its symbolism, but that's a cross, you know, the interior, you know, another big cross, right? If we look out here in the distance in this courtyard back here, there are more crosses. And a tree back there, which again is symbolic in religious iconography. Look at what they're standing on here, right? This thing is full of religious symbolism. And so, like, but Hooch isn't broadcasting that. He's using the structure of the composition to kind of, you know, kind of call your attention very gently to what he's really trying to say, right? And so it's a religious piece, right? But he's composed it like in such a way that the meaning of the work and the subject matter and the form of it, the structure itself, it all works together. That's what you're trying to do. You know, have something to say, you know, the content, like why are you making it? Have the right subject, you know, the what of the piece, what is it? And then, you know, think about how you're going to make it. That's the form. How are you forming it? Okay, what choices are you making in terms of compositional structure and the elements and principles that reinforce the meaning of the piece, right? That's your job as a visual thinker, is to get all of it to work together to create an organic, unified whole, right? Okay, so quickly here, there are other compositional shapes other than pyramids, believe it or not. Diagonals, S-curves, radial designs, L shapes, symmetrical balance, strata, clustered compositions, the cruciform and grid shapes. All of them can be used, and more, right? They're X shapes and figure eights and ovals and circles, and like if there's a shape, you can use it to organize a composition around, right? And you really should do this from the very outset when you're planning things in your thumbnailing stage. You should think about, how am I going to structure it? What shape am I going to use to organize this thing? Okay, so here's an S-curve, right? David's portrait of Napoleon on his horse. There's an S running through that to organize it. Here's his odalisque S shape, right? Oh, like really, S-shaped curves are always like really pleasing. Here's an oval, circle, right? This Caravaggio painting. Check it out. Again, like a simple shape can be the starting point for a great composition. Here are some diagonals in conjunction with a C shape, right? The good old-fashioned Eisenstadt VJ Day photograph, right? Look at the structure of this thing. Really amazing. And then running through that structure is that C shape. Again, have a structure in mind when you're thinking about organizing your compositions. Here's a high horizon compositional structure. The horizon line's way up there. Now there's still, a focal point at 1/3 in the composition, but the horizon line's really high. Likewise, you can have low horizon compositions. Here's a radial design, right? This Kandinsky. Look at all these radiating lines coming out from a central point. Very active. Here's a good old-fashioned L-shape composition, right? I really like L-shapes. Something about them just really pleasing. Here's a strata, right? This Diebenkorn. All those stratified lines are a way of structuring the composition. They can be vertical as well. Here's a cruciform composition, right? Franz Klein. And here's another cruciform that's also a cluster of figures, but in a cruciform shape, right? All of them clustered at a third, right? Remember, rule of thirds, super important. I know it's a rule, and a lot of you bristle at the idea of rules, but look, learn the rule, put it into practice, and then you can break it. I don't care if you break it. You have to prove to me that you know the rule first. You have to demonstrate, okay? Here's that Steelyard compositional balance, just like Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. There's this weight on the right-hand side, but that smaller, more distant object actually carries as much visual interest as the one that's close to us, right? So they do actually balance out. You can do that. Big in the foreground, smaller in the distance. That one in the distance is going to carry more weight than you think it will, okay? Okay, so there you have it. Composition. I know that was a marathon, but it's worth it if you get these strategies into your head and then get them out of your head and into your work, right? I really want you to become more conscious of the elements and principles and components and how to weave them all together into work that will really resonate, that will really excite your viewer and make you feel like you've got a greater purpose than just slapping things together. The more you think about all of these different components and how to unify them and orchestrate them, you'll never be bored, right? It may seem complex to you at the beginning, but the more you do this, the better you're going to get. Remember, it takes study and practice and trial and error. Don't get discouraged. You're going to make plenty of bad pieces, but each piece that you make that is problematic, you're going to learn something. You're going to learn so much more from failure than you ever will success. So don't be afraid to fail. But don't accept that failure, right? Improve. Each piece that you make is going to teach you something if you pay attention. So my hope is that this will give you a boost to start, becoming more conscious about what you're doing as an artist, as a designer, as a composer of visual images. All right, so again, you're armed with knowledge. Go apply it to your work and become great. All right, there you have it. Good luck. I'll talk to you soon.